idea.
Yeah, that was crazy.
All right, we're rolling.
I'm glad it's over.
Everyone
That
looks
was
so
really
dead this
impressive.
morning, as I look straight at you.
Thank you.
No, really?
It makes you feel
That's
so much better.
That's better. Okay. Well, are we up and running here?
We are.
Okay, very good. Well, I would like for today to be, you know, really boring and like depressing. Okay?
Okay.
Someone should say, well, what's new? Well, no, at any rate. Okay, we're going to do a couple of things, and we're going to listen to a piece of music. This is part of my cavalcade of music history, or whatever. And those of you that were here last week, we learned a whole bunch about the progress that music had made at the beginning of the 17th century. We listened to a madrigal from Monteverdi from 1638, one of the greats, in which Monteverdi has decided to create a new style, and that is the stile concitato, or the agitated style. And the madrigal we listened to was from the collection of madrigals of war and love, and everybody leaves out the third one, representation, or stage works. And it combines less overt polyphony with much more chordal-oriented and declamatory ways of representing the sonnet of Petrarch. And if you have a chance, you should investigate Monteverdi and that book of madrigals. It's from 1638. It's a very, very important collection. Well, we skip now about 100 years. And many things took place during the course of the 17th century that contributed to the establishment of all the things that go into making up so-called tonality, or natural musical system that is used in the West. And I want to emphasize again, it isn't Western. It has nothing to do with West, East, North, South, whatever. My opinion about the developments that took place in Europe over the course of time from about the Carolingian Renaissance. When was that? And who is that? What is that?
Like 700s, 800s.
Well, technically speaking, the Carolingian Renaissance began precisely at what time? 800. Yes. On what day?
Christmas.
Yes, that's the crowning of Charlemagne, right? And all right, so many things happened between 800 and, let's say, the beginning of, or the middle of the 18th century. And those things were, in my opinion, an exploration of all of the things that are somehow innately structured in the brain. Or as I read in an article the other day, the mind, which the brain is the mind is the brain, actually. And these things are present in some form or another. And it just took from about 800, maybe before that time, to about 1750, the death of J.S. Bach, and a little bit beyond that, for music to find its sea legs and all the potentials in it. But from about 1750 on, the only thing that really happened in European music, or music of the West, was the integration of chromatics. And so it's fairly obvious from an historical point of view that chromaticism is some addendum, is some superficial element that is added to the system. And in that way, or looked at in that way, it's very similar to the notions in generative grammar of phonology, or morphological changes to words, like the addition of a tense, the change from the present to the past, or some other affix that affects the arrangement of the structure. And it is not part, per se, of the fundamental computational aspect, but it's something that's added to at a later stage and does affect the syntax, and of course, in some way, in some method, has to be reflected in the interface with the sound system, the phonological representation. So that is my take on chromaticism. Well, the events that began to take place during the 18th century after the death of Bach were significant. It's during that time that large-scale form originating in techniques other than imitative polyphony began to emerge. And so what was the outstanding musical form of the late 18th century? No, that disappears, as a matter of fact. What?
Sonata?
Yes, right. So Schinker has the grand idea that the change of style that actually took place at the end of Bach's lifetime, it was really beginning to take place about in the 1730s. But he defines the change of style from the 17th and early 18th century to the later 18th century, or the classical period, as a change in which the repetitions are formed in the music. Now, that's a very mysterious, cryptic statement, but if you look at the music, even look at the music of C.P.E. Bach compared to J.S. Bach, you see that the repetitions are formed in a vastly different way. Instead of piling up imitations in each individual voice, suddenly that disappears, and there's a greater chordal orientation, and they begin to explore short little melodic phrases that appear in one voice. They can appear in other voices. But essentially, that is a means of tying together the melodic ideas or motivic ideas. But the repetitions disappear into the structure of the sounds moving along. And it leads to the development of sonata technique. Sonata is not a form, it's a procedure. Just like, would you say that the construction of a sentence is a form?
No.
What?
Is the construction
No.
of a sonata a form?
It's a process, not a...
Yeah, it's a process. There are sentence forms. See, that's a trick question. All right? And the guy that, is that West over there? Yes. Who worked at the University of Pennsylvania for many, many years. His name is Zelig Harris. Incredible. I wish my name were Zelig. But at any rate, he was a great linguist over there, and he had this idea about kernel sentences, right? The sentence forms, declarative, interrogative, etc. And that those were like various simple forms. He called them kernel sentences. Well, there is such a thing as an interrogative sentence, right? But the process of structuring a string of symbols or words or phonological symbols is a process, not some kind of a predetermined form like a cookie cutter that you use to generate sentences. It's a process. Well, that was Schinker's idea about music. So the idea is that during the course of the 18th century, the form of the repetitions, the character of the repetitions in music changed. And that is what constitutes for him the change in musical style between the so-called Baroque period, whatever that means, and the classical period, whatever that means. Okay? When is Bach's birthday?
March 21st, or 31st, depending on which calendar you use.
What?
Yeah, it wasn't, well, like the old.
What calendar did I use?
Yeah, well, wasn't
Which
there
one?
like,
The one with the
The Russian.
The Mayans.
I like the calendar with pictures of dogs on
The
it.
one that the Sierra Club publishes, or the one with the German Shepherd dogs in it? What calendar?
I don't know. Wasn't there some sort of like, I can never remember if it was the Julian or Gregorian calendar, which changed and moved everything backwards 10 days. So
Oh,
that's why his birthday.
Oh, so it's like daylight savings time, except like
Oh,
daylight
worse.
savings year.
Yeah, it was a whole week, not just an hour.
That would be great. I wish I could do that for years.
That would be
Spring
cool.
So,
forward.
what are Bach's official dates? What does the Wikipedia say?
Johann Sebastian.
March 31st, 16.
Thought knowing the years was enough.
Okay, so new style March 31st, old style March 21st.
Thank you.
March 21st, and the date of the parking meter expiration was
28 July 1750.
1750. What is the purported reason for Bach's untimely demise?
Something to do with like eye surgery?
Yeah.
He had an eye surgery, not LASIK, but
Why
Yeah,
did they
some
perform
kind of-
eye surgery?
Wasn't it the
Right.
second one?
cataract.
Why did they even try? Well, he was
Might
going
have
blind
been.
by that point.
The second one was intended as a corrective, right?
Yeah.
Oh, he
But-
didn't see that one coming.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Oh.
well, presumably, that did him in. All right, well, you know anything about, obviously, we're talking about Bach today for a little bit, right? J.S. Bach. You know anything about
No.
his life?
No.
You don't?
He had a lot of children.
Well, that's kind of a sideline.
He almost got killed by a
Apparently not
bassoonist.
for him, but, you know.
He almost got killed by a bassoonist. Yeah.
He was in jail.
All right, here's one. What's the name of the bassoonist?
Oh.
Ford
Or
launched.
D something.
The one that's not here today.
Do we know?
He entered a competition, and once everyone knew he entered it, everyone gave up. So he won because no one showed up except him. On organ, it was organ improvisation or something. Everyone knew he was so talented that they just didn't want to compete.
There are many apocryphal stories. You don't know that? The organists don't know that?
I mean,
It's a trivia. All right, well, you know, I spent my life at one point trying to fill my life with trivial information like that. Find out who it is. It's an interesting. He got in an argument with this guy one night after a choir rehearsal, right? There were a bunch of apocryphal stories. At any rate, what were Bach's major points of employment, or places of employment? What was the
Weimar.
first really important?
I mean, he
Not
worked, like-
Arnstadt and Mühlhausen, I don't want to know about that. Those are interesting things, but his first big kind of appointment was where?
Weimar?
Weimar, and then after that,
Clothing?
Curtin, Anhalt-Curtin, and that's a period where his responsibilities were principally court music or chamber music or secular music. And then what came after that?
Leipzig.
Leipzig. And what year was that?
1723.
23, yes. And when did his wife die?
Which one?
Good. Isn't it Barbara Maria?
Um,
24?
23, or, well, actually, no, it was before that.
I thought he married Anna Magdalena while he was still working in the second place.
Curtin?
Yeah.
Yes, well, so that means his wife died while he was at Curtin, right? Well, when did she die? Okay, when you find out, you can tell me. All right, so most of the music that comes from the Curtin period, right, is secular music. Very little grand scale organ music. But in Leipzig, a lot of organ music comes about. And also religious music. What was Bach's position in Leipzig? Cantor of the Thomas Schuller. What does that mean? Was he like reciting the Psalms during the service?
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Music.
What was the cantor's position?
Trained with the choir.
That's one thing, but what was it really? The teaching position at the Thomasschule, the choir school, right? It's interesting. What a waste of, well, anyway. But that's really the most prolific period in Bach's lifetime. And was it prolific because he was insanely happy in Leipzig?
Must
No.
No. He was constantly in turmoil with the authorities. Did he write any secular music in Leipzig?
Yeah. Well, tempered clavier, no.
Which volume?
2.
Okay.
I
All right.
just-
Well, we're going to listen to a piece that I think is representative of the advancements in music that had taken place between Monteverdi and about 1725 or 1730. This is from the great Prelude and Fugue in E minor, and BWV 548. What the heck is BWV? I drive a BMW, but that's not the same thing. BMW 548. Mine is a 330, but this Prelude and Fugue is 548. What is BWV?
Werkverzeichnis.
What does that mean?
Catalog.
It's a catalog of the works. And who put that catalog together?
I forget his name.
Oh,
Wolfgang
Not Mozart, no.
Schmieder.
Mozart? Yes, right. Schmieder.
Peter, oh.
Right. It's also it's sometimes the S period is used as a means of referring.
Aren't they coming out with like a revised version of it? Like actually this year?
For the
Maybe.
25th time?
Probably.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to just change?
I'll just take the error
I
label
think
one.
I think it's just adding some
It's gonna
things
be
that are
just
like
backwards.
spurious, not changing any
Well,
of the catalog numbers.
Many of the catalogs have been revised. The Beethoven catalog has been revised, the Schubert catalog. I don't know about Haydn, there's so many pieces. Didn't Haydn make his own catalog of works? We're not talking about Haydn. We will. Okay, well, this is the fugue from that Prelude and Fugue. And it's a really unusual piece, but it's typical of musical technique about the first quarter century of the 18th century. And tell me what you think the form of this piece is, externally. The external repetitions, is there anything repeated in it other than the fact that it is generated by fugal technique? All right, so let's go.
That's
What's
a
the form of
little
that
less
piece?
note.
What?
That's a little less note.
It's really loud too. Okay. What do you think about that? What's the form of that piece? How many of you have ever heard that piece before? Really?
Yeah, I had Brian play it. Brian played it for his grad auditions, so he played it for me.
How marvelous. Okay. Well, what's the form of that piece? Does it have a form? Or is it just
Yes.
like through composed?
Was your choice of registration a clue?
Was it what?
Was it a clue?
Maybe. In a couple of places it might have been. Right. That, well, my approach to registration in Bach is like, you kind of improvise that. You don't plan it out. It just happens. So you set whatever ideas that you or think are in the piece, and then the organ has different manuals. And when you feel like changing the manual for some kind of contrast, you do. I don't believe in very rigid set out registration keys and things like that, particularly in this music. And the same is true with the hair pulling, and angst over how to articulate things. My approach to that is that it should vary according to how you are engaged at the music in that particular point. If there are markings in the score, well, yeah, I think you do have to pay attention to that. But if there are no markings specifically, that proposes a kind of problem. And I don't think it poses a problem if you really know the piece and you have particular and specific conceptions about what you're hearing in it and what you want to hear. And so I'm very flexible about articulation of the fugue subject or the counter subject. I think that varies according to your total engagement in the explication of the music. You have to be listening constantly all the time, as though you're making it up. So I think it should be flexible, and I think it should be varied, and I just think too much has been said about turning those things, the articulation in Baroque music, into like a system. And I know this is controversial, and most people would not agree with me, I think, on it, but I think it's much more spontaneous if you approach the music that way. Now, if you have specific slurrings, whatever, well, that's another issue. I think that you are obligated in some way to pay attention to that. But the mode of conveying that can be quite varied, and I think it should be. But the point is that you're trying to communicate some kind of musical statement. And what you're actually doing, and I really do believe this, and is that it's not, you're not performing Bach. When you perform a piece of music of any kind, you're showing the audience who you are and what you can do. And I know that may sound vain or whatever, but I don't mean it in that sense. It means presumably that you have some kind of total inner engagement with the sound that's embedded in the ink dots that are on a page, and that it is your opportunity to convey what that music means to you. And of course, you do have certain responsibilities, I think. And I am, I guess it's the fact that I've reacted so badly to the kind of musicological training that I had, and the kind of obsessiveness that my own instrument was, that surrounds my own instrument. And I've always tried to strive for some kind of independent expression based on what I feel inside about the music. I mean, anybody, it sounds like any musician talking. But I really think it's very important that you understand that you're not performing Beethoven or Schubert or Schumann. You're looking at a statement that they've made for you to try to figure out how that connects with your inner being as an artist and a musician. And that's the sole interpretive responsibility. So you show people what's inside of you when you approach this music. And if you think that's arrogant or presumptuous or whatever, so be it. That's my only approach to music. And once again, along with that comes an incredible responsibility to the text in a certain way, and to what actually is making the music go. And that's very, very important. And you know what I feel that has to take place in order for that responsibility to be fulfilled. It means that you have to hear it. You have to be able to hear what those things mean. It would be like my arrogance at sitting down and reading a poem in Polish and only being coached in how to pronounce Polish, and to think that the added expression, the punctuation, the inflection, is what it's supposed to be, without the slightest idea of what's contained in the procession of sounds, right? Unless I was a native Polish speaker. And that's just a comparison or metaphor, not meant to be taken literally, but I think it's true. So the engagement with music at all times is based on what you hear and what you are extracting from the music in a pure sonic way. All right, so what is that's obviously me playing, but what's the form of the piece?
Well,
That's a deep subject.
Could you say that it's sort of episodic? Because, partly because it's so long and partly because it's a fugue, it has, places where the subject is repeated prominently and then areas where it kind of ventures off into something else. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think an episode or episodic writing in a fugue is part of the
It's not really a form, though.
academic approach to fugue writing. What is a fugue supposed to be? Supposed to be. It has a what?
Subject.
Don't you all study fugue writing here? You do?
Subject, subject, episode.
You have an exposition, right? Where each voice enters. And when all the voices have entered, that's the end of the exposition. And then what happens? A series of episodes which borrow material from the fugue subject or some element that's contained in it, and intersperses that as a kind of connector, and then usually you have another what?
Exposition.
Some kind of reintroduction of the fugue subject in several voices, one or two voices, and then you have another episode. So it alternates statements of the subject with episodes, and then it concludes usually with some kind of repetition of the subject, and the fugue is over with. Well, is that the pattern that you hear here?
Kind of.
To me, this is a monumental statement of the status of musical technique in the first quarter of the 18th century. And there was no other person alive that could do this with this kind of material, at least that we know about. I mean, many other people wrote fugues. Bach was incredibly influenced by what other person? Buxtehude, yes. And the Buxtehude fugues, or toccata fugue form that he developed, was derived basically from Italian music, instrumental music of the late 16th century. And those fugues are very episodic. they are, or toccata fugues. They begin with a kind of flourish section, a toccata-like section, and then a section in ricercare style, which is strict imitation. And then there's another bridge section, plus another fugal section, a bridge, maybe a concluding section. That's the general state of large-scale instrumental composition at the beginning or at the end of the 17th century, going into the 18th century. When did Bach hear Buxtehude?
Or when he walked like a really long time.
And he was supposed to be
What's
absent for 4 weeks, but he was actually gone for 4
4
months.
months.
He got,
Yes,
like,
yes,
huge
he had
trouble.
a reservation at the Marriott in Lübeck, right? And he walked a 100-foot journey. Did you ever see that film? It's such a great film. Right, to hear Buxtehude. Well, that's very interesting. What about Buxtehude's music? Did Buxtehude like copy his own music or write out his own music?
He didn't, wait, isn't a lot of it a tablature
Mm-hmm.
originally?
And did Buxtehude produce those tablatures?
No.
No, he didn't. Right? It's like the Vedas, right? They were copied out long after the fact. Well, not too long after the fact. But, all right, well, that's also curiously interesting. What's the form of this piece? Is it episodic like a Bach fugue, like a Buxtehude fugue? Well, maybe the playing is so chaotic you can't tell. Right?
It's longer winded than Buxtehude, more verbose.
Yeah, well, no. What are the technical features of this? Does it have an exposition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course it has a very clear exposition. And then right after that exposition ends in what area or on what degree?
1.
Yeah, it's closed off, completely closed off in the fundamental or the tonic. And then what happens?
16 change
Yeah.
registration. Yeah.
Oh, there's
Change
something
of
even more
texture.
drastic than that happens. And I think it's very curious. And it's unlike, it's basically unlike anything else in the organ fugues.
Well,
I can't recall anything else, and I've played them all 5,000 times. Right? There's similar things, but nothing like this. Like, play the exposition again, and we'll listen to the first change. Maybe you should, like, turn it up just a little bit. Stop, okay? Now, that's a curious fugue subject. Yes, it's purely diatonic, right? No. So, I spent the first part talking about the intrusion of chromaticism into music. So, what is the real nature of this fugue?
Only missing one tone out of the 12.
Obviously, I think it starts on an E, right? Okay? Now, if this is in E minor, there's a whole step between the first and the second degree, and then a half step between the second and the third degree. Yeah? Okay. Now, I do want to point out that in my approach to the symbolic nature of the diatonic system, right, there are two natural series in this. There's the minor series, in which all of the principal degrees, the fundamental, the fifth above, and the fifth below, all share the same properties in the third merges that create the triads. It's the only other position in the diatonic system where that is true. In the major system, there are major triads, which is a merge of the 2/3 on the fundamental, on the fifth above, and the fifth below. The 3 to 2 and the 2 to 3. They're all the same. And if you shift those notes around in the diatonic system, you will never find that congruence, except in the third below the fundamental, which we call the minor, right? And those triadic structures result in the merge of the two-thirds spaces yield the same properties, minor, as they do in major, as major. Now what is that? What's the significance of it? Do you know what I'm talking about? Or am I not saying that correctly? It could be not saying it correctly. Right? If that constitutes a major triad, those things are assembled, can be assembled, although like this. Right? So these are that's the 3 to 2, this is the 2 to 3, and this is the fundamental. Well, now look at this for just a minute. That assembly constitutes the two, those are two consonant thirds, yes? What about the assembly on the fifth degree? Is that a consonant third?
With itself or with the fundamental?
With the degrees, they're 2, 4, and 7 are always dissonant. Always. Which degree in this is dissonant? It's that, yes? That's consonant. That is dissonant, and that is dissonant, yes? But these two thirds merged together give you a major, so-called major triad, right? What about this? That's dissonant, and that's consonant, totally, yes? All right, but now there's something beyond that creates the parallel or the similarity between the major and the minor. And that is if you buy into the idea that the major triad is actually an assembly of a major and a minor third, right? In which the major third projects, or it's given its label, right? Now this has no order. These two tones don't, these two thirds are not in any specific order. But if I decide that we're going to project the minor third, then you have a minor triad, right? And this is what led me to understand that the triads themselves are not atomic entities. They become that on a much higher level. But at the fundamental level, they're assembled this way, right? Now, in the minor mode, the reversal, or the indication of the label, what projects first, determines the quality of the triad, major and or minor. Well, the only place in the system, diatonic system, where that occurs naturally is in the third below. Okay, so in this fugue subject, in the key of E minor, the F sharp is the second degree. That is a dissonant tone. The G is consonant, the A would be dissonant, the B is consonant, the C is consonant, the D is dissonant, and the E is consonant, right? Okay, now this fugue subject, generally called a wedge, right, uses some chromatic tones. But let's take those out. We have to include the F sharp because that's a diatonic part of the system. So, diatonically expressed, you move from there to that note, right? And then from there you move to F sharp, yes? Are you all with me?
Yes.
And then what? Let's play it again.
Re and so.
Take out all the accidentals. Stop. All right, so what are the diatonic notes here?
Stays on re in the lower voice and moves up to soul, like Will said.
And then do.
Re,
Well, it's
sol,
an ascending voice and a descending
la,
voice, just
do, si.
Oh, I see.
re, do, si.
Yeah.
Fa, sol, la, si.
Mi, re, do, si, mi, fa, sol, la, si, right? This is the 5 to 6. Now, interestingly, in this particular progression, is this always a do sharp here?
No,
This actually becomes a natural, yes?
it's not always a re, natural, or sharp either.
Okay, well, so what is the final interval here?
Augmented
It's
6.
an augmented sixth, yes? This becomes an augmented sixth, leading out to the octave, right? But this is a 5 to 6, so the fugue subject itself is going to stall out right here, and you have this motion of the 5 to the 6. This is completely disguised, or changed, or amplified by the chromaticism. The first thing you have is this, right? Followed by that, then what happens?
Goes natural.
Natural, right? And then sharp,
Yeah.
yes? Then
Sharp.
sharp,
Natural. Or half step up.
Do, la, si, si.
this becomes sharp, then natural, right?
Yes.
Then, what about that?
Natural
Sharp.
sharp.
Wait. Yeah.
Sharp, natural,
Natural
Natural.
sharp.
natural, sharp,
Mm-hmm.
yeah?
The
Okay.
placement of the C, the do in relationship to the soul is not correct.
What?
Yeah,
Do
sure.
does not come before soul. Do comes after soul.
Well,
Oh.
maybe. I don't know. Okay?
You want me to play that?
I mean, literally, yes, but maybe not. Okay? So let's figure something out here. Right, if we take the diatonic tones away, what do you see in this?
A pizza.
Do you
A
see that
wedge.
this is like a transformed consonance? Yes? All right, because of the arpeggiation in the intervals, or the melodic form of this, the tones are not exactly in this alignment, but this is what's implied, right? So at least I think it is. All right, so you have this transformed consonance, and then you have this. Is that a natural consonance? It is, isn't it? Yes? Okay, then
Oh,
that is a consonance, 5 to 6, leading out to the consonant octave of the boundary interval. Yep? Okay. Now, is there any other relationship that's going on in here?
Probably.
Is this, that's a passing tone, yes? Well, that's a passing tone also. But that's a transformed consonant. What would happen if we moved to the F sharp, right? And this E is like projected over.
Like a fourth species type deal.
Well, this would be like a, what,
7/6.
2-3 suspension, yes? Okay? And then repeating this becomes like a what?
4/5.
4/5, yes? Okay? And then you're stuck here, right, with the fifth, and then going to the sixth and to the octave. Well, the way in which these melodic tones appear creates a kind of displacement of this suspension. This is 4/5, I say, right? And then it's 5/6, all right? But the disposition of these tones kind of obscures that relationship, and also the chromaticism, so that you get this idea that you have this contrary motion that's chromaticized, right? Okay, so that is my analysis of the so-called fugue subject, okay? Now, I believe that you have this progression here, and it stalls out, and it's kind of retarded or slowed down here, and this moves to this augmented sixth before moving to the octave. And then what happens at the tail end of the fugue subject? It's fifth down again, right? And then you get this, right? Yep. Okay. So the structural tone, in my opinion, is probably that, right? So you have E to B, and then you have G to E, right? So in essence, it's simply a horizontalized E chord where you have this 5/6 that accommodates this space, right? And then that is like the terminating or defining interval in the tonality. Now, in the cadence, what do you hear? Remember at the end? I know, I've lived with this piece for at least 5 minutes, right? So I know basically where everything is in it. Not everything, but I know where everything is in it. So what's the cadence at the end? Do you remember it?
There's a trill before the E, isn't there?
Well, what does it descend from?
So, yeah, so far to,
It's this, isn't it?
yeah.
Right. That's the closing third. So that happens in a number of different places, and that's why I argue for, the basic idea coming from this third. And actually the first thing you do here is this, but that's disguised grammatically. All right, let's play it one more time and listen to the exposition. And then I want you to tell me something about the voice that answers this, right? Yeah, okay. What's the nature of the voice, the answering voice?
It starts a tritone above.
A fourth above? Wait.
No, it starts a fifth above.
Bum,
Oh, yeah.
C flat.
No, it starts on
What?
C. It starts up a pretty bit.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's hard to hear.
Do it again.
C, la, da, la,
I
da,
can't hear
la,
organs.
There's a lot of overtones going on too.
All right. Okay. So what kind of answer is that?
A real one.
Real.
It's a
Not a
very
fake
good
one.
answer, right? Okay. What's the difference between a so-called tonal answer and a real answer?
Well, this is an atonal piece.
Now, I'm not getting. This is not a class on fugue writing. What's the difference between those two things? One is an exact imitation of the subject. The other, an interval is changed in the answer, right? Why is the interval changed?
To make it work.
better.
Does it make it work better?
That the relationship between intervals within the subject is exactly the same.
Yeah, well, look at this. I do not play any instrument anymore. Right? And what is the answer to that? did this.
You'd be in the wrong key.
No,
Wait,
I
it's just
mean,
one note different.
I'm not gonna do it today, but I have improvised the opening of that with a real answer. And absolutely no one could tell the difference that I was playing a wrong note. Of course, I fudged on the counter subject a little bit.
Yeah.
But you can. I mean, so what is the point of tonal and real answers?
Variety.
Confirm the tonality.
Well, isn't that confirming the tonality? I mean, I literally, in that fugue subject, sol to do, right? Instead of sol, re, then to mi flat. I don't know, it seems so mysterious to me. And there are millions of arguments, and people like, you know, blow their, you know, they get like a blowfish. They like, you know, what do you mean? The difference between tonal and real answers. Well, I don't know. I have no idea, right? But this is a real answer, yeah? If you look closely at the Bach organ fugues, and they are very different from the fugues in the well-tempered clavichord, all right? They're very, very different. They're much more expansive. A lot of those fugue subjects have real answers, not tonal answers. Some of them do.
The TAF has a lot of tonal answers.
What?
The TAF has a lot of tonal answers,
Yeah.
but it doesn't ever did not touch it. But it also never goes out of C major.
What?
And
No.
also like hardly ever goes out of C major.
All right.
It's a nice cute state.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's continue. Does this have a counter subject?
Yes.
Let's listen one more time to the opening voices. Stop, okay? It has a counter subject. What's the nature of that counter subject? Is it completely diatonic?
No.
It actually kind of imitates the subject, does it
Yeah.
not?
Yes.
And it actually uses the tail of the subject to complete the counter subject. It's a very interesting combination or synthesis of ideas. And I don't know, this is Bach's great genius. When was the composition of this particular piece? Some of the preludes and fugues were put together, you know, like, oh, here's a fugue, here's a prelude, let's put them together. The A major prelude and fugue is an example of that. There are many others. The Fantasy and Fugue in G minor is an example of that. Right? What was my question?
I don't remember.
When was it written?
Preludes.
Yeah, when was it written?
Between 18 some.
What?
1727 and 1736.
Okay.
Right.
Alright.
So 1727 would place it where?
Leipzig.
Leipzig. 1736 would place it where?
Leipzig.
In Leipzig. Yeah.
There's
And
no
if it's
doubt.
1727, well, it's, you know, pretty early on in Leipzig. Now, what kind of music was written in Anhalt-Köthen?
Secular music. A lot of orchestral music.
Yes,
like
orchestral
the
music, right? And presumably, what are the Brandenburg concertos? They're a very pretty pieces. Did you say weird? Did you say that?
No.
What are the Brandenburg concertos or concerti?
A collection of 6 instrumental works presented by
Okay,
Bach.
Wikipedia.
A collection of instrumental works. A collection. And who were they dedicated to? Not written for, but dedicated to the Margrave of Brandenburg. Yeah?
David Ludwig.
Yes.
Sorry, Christian Ludwig.
Okay.
Oh dear.
Well, where do they presumably come from? They come probably from the curtain period.
Yeah.
Now, do you know the Brandenburg concertos?
No.
What is number 4?
Oh.
Violin and 2 flutes.
Yeah.
What?
Huh?
Did you say violin?
And 2 flutes.
Yes. Somebody said oboe. All right. That was originally what? That's a revamp of a, it appears in another orchestration. Find that out, right? So things like that happen all the time. He takes symphonia movements from cantatas and turns them into concerto movements. The Brandenburg 4 is an example of that. The final movement of that concerto, you know what that is?
Presto.
It's a fugue. It's a concerto fugue. And if you look at it carefully, you will see almost a direct correspondence of the formal properties in it to this particular piece of music. All right. Now, I do want to do more work on this, but I'd like to listen to this one more time, and I'm going to talk over it. Okay? I may stop a few more times.
Sure thing.
It really is one of the miracles of art.
Yeah.
Stop. Okay. All right. How many entrances have we had?
4.
4. The last entrance here is on what?
Fifth.
It's on the bender interval. It's on the 5th. Yes. Okay. And what is that? Major or minor?
Minor.
Minor, isn't it?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Oh, by the way, if I play this diatonic fugue or the fugue subject, do you know what key it's in?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
You've got that boundary interval of the, it's produced by the C.
I mean, what
octave.
mode it's in?
Mode?
Well, it's hard to know whether it's major or
It sounds
minor.
minor. That's the minor third.
I mean, just the fugue subject itself, not the little tail.
Well, it's
Well,
tricky. 'cause
That's
you
what
don't-
confirms it, but the fugue subject itself.
Is the minor third in the fugue subject?
No. The minor third doesn't appear until the descending
No.
scale.
Maybe it's because of the augmented sixth.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, well
It could be that, couldn't it?
but it's because of the majors. The do, la.
You might augmented sixth and major though too.
No, but before that also the C sharp and the A natural is sort of like a,
Yes, it
Major.
kinda sounds like major.
yeah, it's a major chord, sorry Dr. Ulrich, built on the 6th degree.
Good to
On
see
the
you.
6th degree with an A.
Dee dum ba. Oh, wait.
That's,
It would be this. If you
Oh,
do
sorry,
it
that's a
diatonically,
That's a 4.
and you take that out, it would be this, right?
Oops.
That's not E
Yes.
minor,
That's-
that's E major.
Major.
I just can't count.
Wrong century. Okay. All right, you don't know that it's minor until the little tag. All right, let's go. Just remember that the exposition of the 4 voices ends in B. It goes E, B, E, B, right? Well, back it up a little bit.
Yeah, I meant to. I just started playing from wherever. It's impossible.
the suspended notes on the top?
The wedge.
That
We just heard.
oh,
Do it once again, back it up just a little bit.
Sure.
Back it up.
Like to back it up and just start playing from wherever I left it.
Right? What are they? Sol, fa, mi. Yes?
Yep.
Re, mi, right, whatever. Yeah, okay. So that's obviously an important detail. That appears in half notes or tied notes or whatever throughout in every single voice. Right? That's derived every single thing is derived from the subject itself. Who rediscovered that after this fugal idea, the technique disappears about mid-century, and everyone goes crazy with the Infinitum kite style, you know, with the little tiny little motives that are supposed to be expressive, and then the chordal orientation that, while people experiment different ways of forming large-scale progressions, and then Haydn suddenly reintegrates fugal technique in his compositions. And what is Haydn really noted for in his sonata movements? A single theme, single thematic idea. It's a direct reference to this kind of compositional technique, where everything comes out of a germ or a single idea. In this case, it's all embedded in the initial fugue subject. If you look at the fugues in the ill-tempered clavier, you see that happening all the time, right? That's why they're used in theory. Okay, let's keep going.
That's it for my battery's parking meter, but Lydia's got it.
It went out.
Already. Yeah, but if you give me 2 seconds, it'll
No,
be Lydia's.
never mind. To be
No.
continued
Right
the
here.
next time.
5
All right.
seconds, just 5 seconds, literally,
Where is it?
close to the bottom.
I'm afraid
Found it.
Got it.
not literal.
Found a witch fever.
We're gonna spend like literally 5 more seconds on this.
Okay.
Okay. let's go
Yeah, that's
forward.
good. Just let it roll.
Oh, okay. Sorry. My finger was already on the thing.
Keep going.
Like this.
All right, stop there, okay? That is the end of the exposition. All right? Before it cadences or ends on the tonic there, right? What has it gone through? From the entrance of the fourth voice on B, what happens? It goes back, it goes E, then what?
A.
A, then B, then E. Yes? Okay. All right. So that's the end of the exposition. So the final entrance is basically getting us back to the tonic. Okay? then this is the episode. This is where the violin and the two flutes would come in, right? An episode. Let's play just the episode.
Sorry.
Good? No, that's fine. Yes, okay? All right. So what is that little episode doing?
The lowest note is like the wedge.
Is the bass like descending?
Yeah.
Okay, play it one more time. I know this is kind of hard to do. Well, it would be for me. Stop. Okay. What's the top note? Bum, bum, right? Oh, wow. That's like the 5 to 6 thing, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, let's continue.
Sorry, too far forward.
Supposed to be G, yes? Okay. So it goes actually from B, chromatically down, right? Ending back up on G. So it's Si, La, Sol, yes? So, Fa, Mi, exactly what this implies. Yeah? All right, put that aside. And now let's go to Professor Hickey. This is one of my favorite stories in here. And I even think Hickey calls it an allegory. What is an allegory? They're
Story.
things that kind of wander on the golf course sometimes in Florida, right?
I haven't had enough golf for mountains.
Alligator.
It was an allegory.
It's like
Really?
sort of related to metaphor.
I thought it was
Yeah, it is kind of related to metaphor,
It's a
but
symbolic story. Yeah.
it's a story. It's a symbolic story that's intended to
Relate to
know,
a situation in real life.
explain something else deeper. Well, this is a story about basketball, or an incident about basketball, that's intended to represent a much deeper idea, or several ideas. You know, last week we talked about I hate to go back to this, but we have to because I'm so irritated by it, the edge thing, the edge effect, right? And the wedge effect, right? All right, but you know, we talked about convergent and convergent and evolution. And what did we say that the edge effect was? That's like I don't know where that term came from, but it's spurious. It's like Limburger cheese, right? But it has some validity, I think. What is the edge? It's the difference between two, it's the organisms that originate at the edge of two different ecological niches or environmental terrains or whatever, yes? So technically, you know, you might be this forest environment and then the savannas, yeah? Okay, well, the edge effect, you know, is I think in terms of ecology or biology, it has, you know, some validity, I think, because there are organisms that do form at the edges of particular environmental niches or things like that. But in the sense that it is being used in various other places, it's like a metaphor. I don't think that metaphor exactly matches, because culture is not like that. Culture, I don't think, can be talked about in terms of edge effects. You can, it's a metaphor, but I don't think it's a particularly good one. And it's not a particularly good one in relationship to human beings. Who's Ardipithecus ramidus? What is that? Didn't we talk about Ardi?
Was that a previous genus before human? Or species before human?
What does the word Ardipithecus mean anyway?
Oh,
Australopithecus, Ardipithecus ramidus.
wait, it's not southern man.
Australopithecus is.
Yeah.
Australopithecus, right, means that. Australopithecus, Ardipithecus ramidus, if you want to be technically correct. But Ardipithecus is what? Ardi means what? Of the ground, right? Ground. Pithecus means ape, right? And ramidus means what?
The Muslim holiday?
What? The Ramidus Inn? Right, no.
No. Does it come from the same root as ramifications?
What?
Does it come from the same root as ramifications?
It means root.
Oh.
It does mean that.
Okay. Well. Okay.
It means first.
That was not what I was
So,
expecting.
according to the discoveries so far, and I think Ardipithecus is, what, 4 or 5 million years ago? Was like the root of the species. And what was the nature about Ardipithecus? It was definitely ape-like, belonging to Australopithecus, right? But what was significantly different about that?
Bipedal.
Yes, it had definite bipedal locomotion, yeah? And it's that ape that presumably could navigate between the forest and the open savanna. But it was essentially a forest-dwelling creature. Okay. Would you call that an edge creature?
No.
No, I don't think so. So I don't think that, well, at any rate, I just think that's an inappropriate metaphor for kind of cultural explanations. However, this allegory or this story is a very appropriate one, I think, in terms of human endeavor and certain properties of human beings. Have you all read it? Yes, Dr. Watson, I have. Okay, well, good. It's about my favorite sport. No, it isn't. Right.
What is your favorite sport?
What?
What is your favorite sport?
Well,
Bassoon?
Music.
Morgan.
I was a gymnast and I ran track. And I was on the bantamweight wrestling team. It was very good. And I was a good gymnast. And I was a good track runner. And I love tennis. I don't play it anymore. And I used to play racquetball at the sporting club with any willing student here. That's a great game. Incredible, incredible game. Used to play at 6 o'clock in the morning with whatever brass player I could find.
Take a number.
Actually, it was mostly brass players. But, so does that answer that question? I hate football. I think that's I think that, doesn't he refer to as like warring factions or warring nations?
Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly violent game. And I don't think soccer is like that. I think soccer is like a relatively elegant game, and it's related to track. So you have to run
And acting.
Oh,
because you have
I'm
to
sorry. In high school, I did play baseball. You know, I was very bad at it. I'd say I was a C+ player. But the position that I played was not. I mean, that kind of mitigates the C+ thing. So I'm not a big sports fan like that, right? But at any rate, basketball is an intriguing game. And this tells you a little bit about the history of basketball. When was basketball invented? Who was alive when basketball was invented?
You were.
Yes, I was. Was Brahms alive?
Probably not. Did he die in like... When did Brahms die?
1890.
Why did they?
Wasn't basketball made in like 1891?
97.
Okay, so
When was basketball invented?
1894.
1891. And what was the name of the guy who invented it?
James
Naismith.
Naismith, yes. It's from your part of the country.
Springfield, Mass.
Yeah, I'm telling you, that's what it's noted for.
I
Well,
know.
look, Springfield, Ludlow,
Yeah.
Holyoke, all those
Volleyball.
places in Massachusetts, right? What kind of towns are those?
Milltown.
Mill towns, yes. All right? And so consequently, they were populated essentially by what?
Workers.
Where did the workers come from?
Australopithecus.
Some people
I mean,
thought so.
they were all immigrants. Like,
Yes,
which
there were
town was it?
immigrants. Italian, French, Polish.
Portuguese.
Yes,
Ukrainian,
Portuguese. Yeah, a lot of Portuguese people.
Polish.
Yeah, and they found work and success in a life. I don't know how happy it was, but think about that. Those immigrants in the mill towns. They're not the mills all closed, I think.
They're still there though.
Yeah, they are still there, but think about that. You know, you have this industry, and you employ all of these people that come to America to, you know, find a new way of living. And so you have people, workers in the mill, they earn a living, they get a house, and then you have to have something to eat, so you have grocers, you have butchers, you have to have some kind of medication to live on, right? So you have drugstores or whatever, you have cleaners or laundry, you have all kinds of things that become a society, hopefully a civil society. Yeah, I may be wrong, but America was founded on that, yeah? That's why you have the towns. So, at any rate, I don't want to get too political, but let's build a wall. Okay? All right, here we go. This is just incredible. It describes an incident that occurred in the 80s, I think, yeah? In the playoffs, NBA Finals, right? And it's a spectacular move. And let's go through these various places. If you read it, you can help me comment on it. We're in the middle of the first page, the second paragraph. Just the celestial athleticism of it, of the play he's talking about, is stunning. But the tenacity and purposefulness of it, the fluid stream of instantaneous micro-decisions that go into Irving's completing it, well, it just breaks your heart. It's everything you want to do by way of finishing under pressure, beyond the point of no return, faced with adversity. And I'm still amazed when I think of it. Well, if you can't relate, to, stepping out on the stage and sitting down and, saying, here we go, and just letting it happen, well, I don't know. It's exactly the same thing. What does it say? The tenacity and purposefulness of it, the fluid stream of instantaneous micro-decisions that go into Irving's completing it. Now, the micro-decisions, do you really have any control over that? No, I don't think so. I think that those decisions are somehow beyond your control. The actions themselves you experience immediately after they happen. I mean, it's been proven many, many, many times over and over and over again. When you go to pick up a coffee cup, that motion is already happening before you even do that, before you're consciously aware of it. So the athleticism or the skill is something that you have that's put into motion by the ability to make these instantaneous decisions. In my opinion, music making, or when you're performing, has to be exactly that same way. Right. I believe that it is. And I try to approach that every time I sat down to play. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And of course it has to work if you're improvising. That's why I encourage you, every time you do a public performance, you put improvisation on your program, provided you can do it, right? You've had enough counterpoint. At any rate, okay. So let's go to the next page. Here we go, at the top. Talked about this yesterday. Irving's instantaneous, pluperfect response to it, both necessary and possible. Thus the joy, because everyone behaved perfectly, eloquently, with mutual respect, and something magic happened. Thus the joy at the triumph of civil society in an act that was clearly the product of talent and will, there you go, accommodating itself to liberating rules. I missed it from the bottom, right? Go back. Since it was Karim's perfect defense that made Irving's instantaneous, pluperfect response to it both necessary and possible. You know, what Abdul Karim, that's not his real name. You know.
Oh, the really tall guy?
What? Yeah, he's a really tall
Abdul
guy. He
Jabbar.
was a
Star
center
airplane.
for the Lakers, yeah?
Kareem.
I think didn't Jabbar, Kareem Jabbar, Abdul Kareem Jabbar, is that his name?
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Something like that, right? Didn't he score the most points of any other NBA player in history? I think so. I don't know anything about it, but I know that for some reason. Okay, so it's talking about cooperation here, right? So Kareem is the center, and I believe that Dr. J, or whatever his name was, it was a point guard, right? And he did this like fantastic move from behind the backboard, coming around from the left-hand side. Hickey described it so beautifully. And he says that thus the joy became, because everyone behaved perfectly, eloquently, with mutual respect. And something magic happened. Thus the joy at the triumph of civil society in an act that was clearly the product of talent and will, accommodating itself to liberating rules. Well, this is one of the major points in this essay. It's what is the purpose of rules in a civil society? And Hickey does quote Thomas Jefferson, or makes reference to Thomas Jefferson. But we'll go on because there's so many important things on this one page. Consider for a moment Dr. J's play was at once new and fair, because he was not out of bounds. The rules made by people who couldn't begin to imagine this play made it possible. If this doesn't intrigue you, it certainly intrigues me, because to be blunt, I've always had problems with the rules. Well, it's kind of like me talking. All right. Now, let's go down the paragraph a little more. I've never been able to internalize rules. To this day, I never stop at a stop sign without mentally patting myself on the back for my act of good citizenship. But I do stop, well, usually, because the alternative to living with rules, as I discovered when I finally learned some, is just hell. It is a life of perpetual terror, self-conscious wariness, and self-deluding ferocity, which is not just barbarity, but the condition of not knowing that you are a barbarian. Now, I'll have to say that in Siddhartha, we learned a lot about the relationship of men and women through Kamala's attitudes. Well, here you learn something about women and men, men's relationship to women, I think. Did you get anything out of that? Maybe you have to put 2 and 3 together. That has a direct relationship, what he's talking about, to civil behavior. Especially civil relationships between men and women. Not to mention between men and women, but men and women. And what are the rules in a civil society? They can be like rules in a civil society, or they can be ethical principles, right? The principles of relations between people. And so what does he make? He makes a very clear statement. This is a man talking about 2 male basketball teams. I finally learned some, because without the rules, life is a perpetual terror, self-conscious awareness, and deluding ferocity, which is just not barbarity, but the condition of not knowing that you are a barbarian.
Like the animal world?
What?
Like the animal world?
Well, I don't think the animals are barbarians.
But they don't know that they're barbarian.
They don't know that they're not barbarians.
Mm.
They just are, right? But that is not about, I mean, when you talk about human beings, you have to understand that we are animals, right? Right. But if we were mere animals, we wouldn't be worrying about being barbarians. We wouldn't be worrying about rules for civil society. Nature imposes the rules in nature. And so therefore, nature, generally by and large, run in perfect harmony. And along come human beings who have this awakened sense or different relationship to nature. And that's all mental. And so we look at nature and say, the lion attacking the jackal, that's violent. The grizzly bear, you know, with this huge claws. Have you ever seen the grizzly bear? I've not had a personal encounter with one, but, you know, the snatching of the salmon out of the water, and somebody gave me a photograph of this grizzly bear, you know, coming out of the water, and it's got this salmon in its mouth, and the expression on the salmon's face, I know I'm being anthropomorphic here, but it's like that. I thought, oh, sad. You know, nobody knows anything about that, right? But unfortunately, human beings look at that and they say, oh, how violent, how imposing, right? But humans do behave in a violent way. Yeah?
That's why we have rules.
Right, exactly. We do have rules. And actually, sometimes those rules aren't the ones that we make up for a civil society. They are the rules of nature. Yes? So if you do certain things to yourself, then the rules of nature interpose, and your parking meter expires prematurely. But he's talking here about rules in a civil society. And then he goes on later to say, did you get the point? You know, okay. So Camille Paglia says that what is all this nonsense about feminism, gender, and sex and all of that? Nobody's talking about the right thing, right? Nobody's talking about biology and the difference between men and women. And I think she gets like a triple check mark. And then she goes on to say, and I think this is actually true, even though, you know, I am a male of some sort. Men have to be educated. Men have to be tamed. Not tamed, she doesn't use, well, maybe she does use the word tamed. They have to be taught in a certain way to behave in a civil society, right? And I do believe that. And that's exactly what he's talking about, for everybody, actually, but particularly, you know, for himself as one of these barbarian males. Now, I know that flies in the face of most all of my neighbors in the mountains of North Carolina. But you don't live in the mountains of North Carolina, and you're not a man either. And you don't make moonshine either.
I know people who do.
Yeah. so
I'm
do
only
I.
about an hour away.
Okay. All right. No hunting on my property. Right, okay. And this is never to know the light, wait a minute. Did I do all this? I discovered and I finally learned some, it's just life, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and this is never to know the lightness of joy or even the possibility of it, because such joys as are attended upon Dr. J's play require civilizing rules that attenuate violence and defer death. They require rules that translate the pain of violent conflict into the pleasures of disputation. What is that?
Disputing, arguing, having a
Argument,
disagreement.
yes. Into the excitements of politics, the delights of rhetorical art, and competitive sport. Moreover, the maintenance of such joys requires that we recognize, as Thomas Jefferson did, that the liberating rule that civilized us yesterday will almost inevitably seek to govern us tomorrow. By suppressing both the pleasure and the disputation, in doing so, it becomes a form of violence itself. Oh my gosh.
So is he saying that violence is something that's like part of us that we can't get rid of, so we have to like transform it in a way with these types of things? Or rules?
Well, then yes.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, yes, he's saying that. That's what the rules are, right? I'm so thrilled that the Metropolitan Opera is bringing back the rent cycle next year. And
The
so,
red cycle.
if you're in the seminar,
Not
which
the skin cycle.
you signed a contract to be unless you graduated, we're going to the Met, and I think I will do the ring cycle again
The whole
next
thing?
year. What?
The whole thing.
Standing.
Yeah.
Retired.
Because it's exactly about
Michael,
this.
the principal trumpet
It's about this same story, right? What's in the Rhine?
Gold.
The purity of creation, right? The purity of creativity. And, it pervades the ever-flowing Rhine that connects with Siddhartha, doesn't it? And it's protected by the beautiful little Rhine maidens, right? Okay, did you see The Shape of Water? It's not a Rhine maiden, it's a Rhine man, right? It's actually a remake of Creature from the Black Lagoon, but whatever. All right, so what happens? Albert, the ugly troll, comes in and steals the gold, right?
And swears off love forever.
Okay? And what does Wotan do?
Steals it.
He wanders the world and he comes in to the what? The tree of knowledge, yes? That's an old Norse myth. Odin, right? And in the Norse myths, there's this tree. It's like the tree of life or whatever. It has a name, I think. And
Oh, yeah.
there's streams that flow around it. And it symbolizes the ever-eternal flow of life and perfect harmony and all that kind of stuff. The same as the Rheingold, essentially. And so what does Wotan do?
Like
He
cutting
cuts a branch off the tree, and on it he inscribes the runic symbols, or the runes, the laws that govern man. And so what happens to the tree?
It died.
It withers away, dies. And so consequently, there's this dichotomy, or this split, between something that is taken and something that is taken for a good purpose. Laws to govern man, and the other is just out and out thievery, right? For personal power. But in the end, they both end up being what? For personal gain, right? And so both things have to collapse. The ring or the gold is returned to the Rhine, and Valhalla, the eternal city of justice and fairness for all,
Burns down.
has to collapse, right? So that's an interesting point. And that's exactly the point that Thomas Jefferson is making and Hickey is making. rules are liberating, but when they become a means of governance or prescriptions, they cease to lose that property to them. And you descend back into barbarianism or tyranny. Yep. In some way, I think that this has like the Liberty Bell is ringing again, right? I think. I don't know. All right. Let's go to the next page.
Oh.
Henceforth, wow, that was a Freudian slip, right? Henceforth, it has always seemed to me that the trick of civilization lies in recognizing the moment when a rule ceases to liberate and begins to govern. And this brings us back to the glory of hoops, because among of all the arts of disputation our culture provides, basketball has been supreme in recognizing this moment of portending government. What does portending mean?
Foreboding?
What?
Portenting? Wait, where is it? Oh.
Portending. What does that mean?
Staccato under it, no?
What?
No.
Portato?
No. I wish it meant
Type of
that.
a mushroom.
It's like prophesying, right?
Oh.
And in deflecting it by changing the rules when they threaten to make the game less beautiful, less visible, when the game stops liberating and becomes to educate. And the second point, maybe the third point. Rules are a means of liberating. And the second point here, when the rules become like a means of governance, right? The game stops being liberating and begins to educate, right? And then he goes into his point that he makes over and over and over and over again. The fact remains that every style change that basketball has undergone in this century has been motivated by a desire to make the game more joyful, various, and articulate, while nearly every style change in fine art has been, and that's all inclusive, right, in some way motivated by the opposite agenda. Thus, basketball, which began this century as a pedagogical discipline, right, for rowdy young men, concludes it as a much beloved public spectacle, while fine art, which began this century as a much beloved public spectacle, has ended up where basketball began, in the YMCA, or its equivalent, governed rather than liberated by its rules. So what do you think about that?
Interesting, because I thought that he was going to say that basketball began as some sort of liberating activity because it was created to channel like the unruly like young guys, like their violence or whatever you want to call it, into something like that had a structure to it.
Well, it is that, I mean, the rules of basketball were intended to civilize these people, right?
So it's just gotten more that way. It didn't start out as, well, I don't know, never mind, it's splitting hairs, but it sounds like he's saying that basketball started out like something that fine art is like descending into.
Well, I mean, the rule boundness and the fact
Yeah.
that rules can govern rather than liberate.
Yeah.
That's the idea. And I think it's a very important idea. What do you think about that idea? Do you think that's true? Do you think that if the liberating rules, and you know that this is all allegorical, I think. What are the liberating rules in art?
I feel like one has to find ways to be liberated with whatever rules are there. Like, I don't know if it's something inherent in the rules themselves that makes it so that you can be liberated or not. Like, it's kind of how you treat the rules, or like, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a
I mean,
part of
there
it.
is a line, obviously, that, like, rules can control, but it's like, it's hard to say, like, what rules versus what the difference is between rules that liberate and govern.
Well, what is the difference? How do they make that transition? He's saying, well, what does he say?
Well, by trends of like what's happening, like he describes it as it becoming, like if there's a rule that it can become something that is like by observation, rather than something that's inherently in the rule. Like if there's a rule and then it starts to govern instead of, it's not that's only something that you would know based on observation of that.
Okay,
I think it's very circumstantial, isn't it?
what is circumstantial? The rules are circumstantial?
When all of them are the same.
The governance versus liberation.
Like it depends on.
I mean, take as example of a stop sign. It's liberating if there's other cars coming and you would die, but it's governing if it's forcing you to stop when it's not necessary. It's like the rules can't possibly specify every eventuality. And so, even though that's only on a micro level, even though he's talking about much greater issues.
But the idea of a stop sign is to thwart or try to thwart unpredictable situations, is it not? Right, so it's there.
I think the rules that
And he said, that's what he says about the stop sign. He says, I pat myself on the back when I stop at the stop sign, usually, right? But but if there's a policeman sitting there at the stop sign, and you don't exactly stop, to 0 miles per hour, you're thrown in jail, right?
That would not be
That's a
liberating.
police state. But,
That'd be really.
all right, and before we leave, I must make an announcement. Have a wonderful spring break, right? I will not return to the Curtis Institute until Wednesday after spring break. There will be no classes on Monday or Tuesday, the 26th through the 27th. I will see you in seminar on the 28th and the 29th.
Are you here tomorrow? Or?
Yes, I'll be here all week. Okay. Well, let's stop there for today, and we're going to continue with this and get more deeply into it, because there are many more ideas that we need to explore. Thank you.